On this episode of How to Bronco, Loren and I are talking all about lifting your Bronco. Welcome to How to Bronco for Fun Havers. I'm Vaughn Gittin Jr.
And I'm Loren Healy. There's not many people that have more smiles or miles in the new Ford Bronco, and we wanted to create this how-to series to share our experience and expertise to help you get the most out of your Bronco.
Let's have some fun.
Let's go. We're going to share our experience and the pros and cons of each in hopes that you get a clear understanding of the direction that is best to suit your personal goals. We will even get into sharing our experience as how not to fail the factory components.
Let's start with the reasons why you might want to lift your Bronco. Many people just want a visual and stylistic enhancement that a lifted Bronco with larger tires offer.
Others, like myself, want the additional function and ground clearance that a lift and larger tires offer, such as making the rocks and holes you come across off-road effectively smaller.
And such is life, you don't get anything for free. All lifts to your Bronco create a compromise in some area with respect to vehicle dynamics as Ford intended. Right off the showroom floor, the Bronco has passed Ford's comprehensive vehicle dynamics, rollover, and durability test. As received from the factory, the Bronco is extremely capable, and when you lift it, you effectively are on your own with respect to vehicle dynamics. I'm not saying this to scare you, it's just a reality, and it's very important to know some of the compromises that you can expect when you lift your Bronco so you can make the right decision that's best for what you need.
A simple rule of thumb is the more you lift and the higher you go, the more top heavy you effectively make your Bronco and raising the center of gravity. You may notice more roll center on sharp turns, reaction delays when executing evasive maneuvers on and off-road, leaning more while taking off ramps, and a quicker feeling of tipping on any side hill or off-camber terrain that you may come across. You are also increasing the likelihood of ending up on your roof in a bad situation versus a stock ride height truck, given the change in vehicle dynamics.
The good news is that from our experience, the Bronco is very stable, even with 2 to 3 inches of lift on it for normal driving. But the more aggressive you drive, the more you can notice it wanting to lift a tire with a lift versus factory ride height. One thing to also remember is that the larger wheels and or tires are almost always more weight. More weight is more load on components, and not all components that this could affect have been validated for this. So you do increase the risk of failures. We'll get to that in a bit.
There are many ways to lift your Bronco, and which way is right for you is really dependent on your personal goals and ambitions. We really recommend that you be honest with yourself first as to what you really expect to do with your Bronco when choosing how to lift your Bronco. It is also worth noting that buying parts from a reputable company that actually has experience with the platform and does real-world testing and validation is a very smart move. Before we jump into the ways you can lift your 6th gen Bronco, let's look at the production ground clearance numbers, which are measured at the lowest point of the engine shield just below the front axles. So the base ground clearance from that skid plate to the ground is 8.4 inches. The Bronco Sasquatch, that's 11.5 inches. And the new Bronco Raptor, that's gonna be 13.1 inches of ground clearance.
So the first way we'll discuss to lift your Bronco is shock spacers, like these from RTR vehicles, which are the easiest to install and the price is very low. They simply bolt on between the shock mount and the shock, creating lift. They do increase ground clearance of everything aside from the front control arms and the rear axle. They do not increase suspension travel. Shock spacers compromise the geometry of the upper control arm, which will cause the upper ball joint to max out sooner and the steering arm angle to change, which creates more leverage on them and the steering rack, effectively making them weaker when they see significant loads. It is also important to know that this type of lift can take your front axle shafts past the intended operating angles, which can lead to axle or CV failure. This type of lift will retain factory feel with respect to ride quality. However, it will increase bump steer and allow more droop than the front end components were designed for, which could end up in failures like I mentioned previously. The shock spacer lift is mainly for aesthetic enhancement and is frankly the cheapest, easiest way to get larger tires on your Bronco. While light off-roading is okay, it is not suggested to do any aggressive off-roading with this type of lift. And if you do, there is a serious chance of component failure, especially the steering system. The biggest risk for failure that we have seen with this type of lift is during rock crawling, especially when heavy throttle is applied, such as bumping up ledges.
Another lifting option is lower perch lift collars, aka preload collars or spring preload spacers. Both of these lift the Bronco by adding preload to the spring. Preload presses the spring down, raising the spring rate, and with the higher position collars or the spring spacer installed, that preload spring creates more lift. They are cheap to buy and a bit more involved to install, as the shock spring has to come apart to install either of these options. This type of lift does earn the lifted look as well as enable larger tires. The lift alone increases ground clearance of everything aside from front control arms and the rear axle. This type of lift does not affect the geometry of the steering suspension or the suspension arms. However, it does create more articulation for the front axle at ride height. There is a high likelihood of coil bind, which is when the spring touches itself, which you never want to happen under any circumstances. Bump steer will also increase with this type of lift. This type of lift does not limit up travel. If you increase tire size, there is a good likelihood that you would make contact with the body at full compression when you are fully articulated. This type of lift will also result in noticeably harsher riding during most driving, as it is effectively increasing the rate of the spring. Off-road performance will be compromised when compared to factory due to the increase in effective spring rate, with the main benefit being a bit more ground clearance.
The last cheap way to raise the Bronco is a body lift. This is done by putting a spacer between the frame and the body of the Bronco. All suspension and steering geometry is unaffected and the ride quality will remain the same. You do not earn any type of ground clearance benefits from this type of lift on its own, but you can allow room for larger tires, which can earn some ground clearance benefits for the entire truck. The benefit to the off-road performance with this type of lift is all based on what tires you install. You can also expect to see some gaps where the body and respective filler panels meet the frame depending on how much you lift it.
Complete replacement coilover systems like these Fox 2.5 Performance Series coilovers are the answer to increased performance and minimal compromise when lifting your Broncos. This type of lift offers up to 4.5 inches of lift depending upon the base vehicle. This type of lift does not compromise ride quality, and some manufacturers are even claiming ride quality benefits on and off-road. Overall suspension travel is increased, and increased travel means more capability and comfort in almost all off-road scenarios. They also offer adjustable dampening so that you can soften or stiffen to your liking for performance or comfort. With this type of lift, ground clearance is increased everywhere other than the axle and lower control arms. This type of lift also enables you to run larger tires, which is where you can earn more clearance from your front lower arms and rear axle. The only downside to this type of lift is that you can exceed the upper ball joint's range of motion. An aftermarket upper control arm, such as the one from Fun Haver Off-Road, is highly suggested to us and most coilover manufacturers. If the coilover system is designed properly, the axle and the tie rod angle should be within safe operating ranges. However, it is possible to get them out of spec if proper engineering was not done. We do know that Fox has spent the time to do proper engineering, and at the time of this video, we have over 8,000 miles on a set of Fox coilovers, putting them to the test in places like Moab, the Rubicon, Johnson Valley, with zero problems or failures.
For those of you looking for a significant increase in off-road capability, a long travel or mid-travel suspension system like this one available from Fun Haver Off-Road is your answer. It's worth noting that all of the Fun Haver Off-Road developed and designed products will be sold through our partners at Project X Off-Road starting Q1 2023. Click the link below to get on the list to be notified when these products are available. Not only will a system like this lift your Bronco and allow for larger tires, it also widens the track width, which will increase the stability and also increases suspension travel for capability to eat bigger whoops and enjoy more plush jump landings. For example, this type of system is similar to what Ford has done with the Bronco Raptor to increase performance. This is a significantly involved bolt-on product that may require some cutting and trimming depending how large of a tire you decide to install.
Another option, and probably the most expensive way to lift your Bronco, is by installing portals. Portals replace the upright in the front and bolt to the axle in the rear. They raise the Bronco, creating clearance everywhere, including the axle and the control arm. Portals can be used in conjunction with almost any other lift and add additional track width. Ride quality is dependent on the components, and another huge benefit of portals is that they take load off of all the drivetrain due to the gears inside the portal box themselves, which is beneficial when larger tires are brought to the equation. Our team at Funhaver is currently developing a system with 74 wells for fellow Bronco owners that want to go the route of portals.
In addition to looking awesome, larger tires create ground clearance for everything, including the control arms and axle. They also make any holes or rocks that you may encounter effectively smaller for easier conquering of rough terrain. Now, here's the disclaimer and warning specifically related to Broncos based on our experience. Broncos were designed for up to 35-inch tires. Anything larger than 35-inch tires is putting more load on the drivetrain and steering components, which is outside of the box that Ford engineered and durability tested the truck with. Basically, anything that you do on this front is increasing risk of failure, especially while being aggressive off-road. I also want to share that Loren nor I have ever failed anything on a stock Bronco, and we have done some very crazy things and have been extremely aggressive. The only failures we have seen are when larger tires are involved and or there is aggressive throttle inputs to get over an obstacle without momentum, such as executing the famous bump. Given the details we have mentioned about lifting your Bronco, we hope that you acknowledge that it is very important that you choose your approach to lifting your Bronco based on how you intend to use it. As I mentioned, some lifts are better than others when it comes to off-road performance. But a general rule of thumb is that if you choose to put a lift and larger tires on your Bronco, you need to understand that you have increased the potential of component failures over time or while aggressively off-roading in the following areas. Steering components such as tie rods and or the steering rack, unless you upgrade to a more capable complete steering solution. It is important to know that just increasing the strength of the tie rod will move the failure point to the steering rack. We look at the tie rods as a fuse because they're easy to change in the case of failure. Whereas if you make the tie rod stronger, you just risk failing the steering rack, which is a lot harder to fix on the trail. The drivetrain. The axles, differentials, and transfer case were built to handle 35-inch tires. While we have never failed any of these components, it is logical to understand that the increased weight and loads could result in failures, especially if you have a very, very heavy right foot. If you're anything like us and you're going to lift your Bronco and put larger tires on it, regardless of these realities, the number one thing that I can suggest to limit the potential failures is to be aware of what you're doing with your throttle inputs. Almost all failures we have seen have been the result of being too aggressive on the throttle, navigating technical obstacles. Momentum is your friend, as is a smooth and steady right foot. If you're aggressively standing on the throttle, creating bucking and are uncontrolled wheel spin that can result in significant shock loads, you are at risk of failing a component. This is a general rule of thumb that the likelihood is increased with a lift and larger, heavier wheels and or tires.
We hope you've learned something from this episode of How to Bronco. Choose your lift wisely.
Please leave a comment below with what other information you would like to see us share and what lifts you have chosen and how you like it on your Bronco. Most importantly, have fun, friends. We'll see you next time.